The town of Saltmere had a way of making failures visible. It wasn't a cruel place by design, but small coastal communities have long memories and even longer winters, and when there's little to do but talk, people's misfortunes become the weather. Discussed over coffee, predicted over beer, analyzed in the queue at the post office. And by the autumn of 2019, no one's failures were more visible than Thomas Harrow's. He stood now at the edge of what the locals called the Wretch, 47 acres of worthless marshland that stretched between the old coast road and the sea cliffs like an infected wound in the landscape. The ground beneath his boots made obscene sucking sounds with each step, and the air hung thick with the smell of rot and brine and something else, something ancient and unnameable that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Behind him, he could hear the whispers. They weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. "Threw away everything his grandfather built," someone said. It sounded like Marcus fell from the hardware store, though Thomas didn't turn to check. 40 years of savings, gone, for this! Thomas pulled his jacket tighter against the October wind and kept his eyes on the marsh. He'd learned not to flinch. His father, Henry Harrow, had died chasing failed schemes, and Thomas had sworn to be different. For 15 years, he'd been steady and reliable, working the farm and paying down debts. Then came the blight, the drought, and the creditors. And then, 3 months ago, came the auction notice for the Wretch. "The geological survey says there's nothing under there but more mud," someone was saying behind him now. The crowd had grown. Of course it had. This was entertainment. "The county's been trying to sell that cesspit for 40 years. Finally found someone stupid enough to buy it." Thomas had read the geological surveys, all 17 of them, dating back to 1962. The land had been tested for oil, for natural gas, for minerals, for anything that might justify its existence. Every survey had come back the same: worthless. The marsh was too wet for development, too salty for agriculture, too unstable for construction. It was a dead zone, a blank space on the map where the earth had simply given up. But Thomas had read something else, too. Something the geologists didn't mention, because geologists dealt in facts, not folklore. He'd read the old stories, the ones his grandfather used to tell on winter nights when the wind rattled the windows and the fire burned low. Stories about the Wretch that went back 300 years to when Saltmere was barely a village and the coast road was just a footpath through the wilderness. The locals had always called it the Wretch, his grandfather said, but that wasn't its first name. The old-timers, the ones who remembered the rememberers, they'd called it the Weeping Ground. Said you could hear it at night if you listened close, a sound like sobbing that rose from the earth itself. Said ship's captains used to navigate by it, steering clear of the coast when they heard that sound carried on the wind, because the weeping ground meant rocks and reefs and the bones of vessels that had learned too late where the deep water ended. But there was another story, too, one his grandfather only told once, late one night after too much whiskey and too much silence. A story about a storm in 1722, about a ship that had tried to run the coastal rocks in darkness, about a crew who'd survived the wreck and come ashore with heavy chests and desperate eyes, about how they'd buried something in the marsh when the tide was low and the moon was dark, and how they'd never come back for it because the Royal Navy found them 3 days later swinging from gibbets in the town square. "Just stories," his grandfather had said, waving his hand dismissively. "Every marsh has treasure stories. Every beach has ghost stories. That's what people do when the land won't give them anything real. They make up something precious." If you're enjoying this story of faith against impossible odds, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories take time and effort to research and bring to life, and your support helps us keep telling them. But the crowd behind him was dispersing now, heading back to their trucks and their comfortable homes and their comfortable certainties. The show was over. Thomas the Fool had spent his inheritance on a swamp, and there was nothing left to see but the slow-motion disaster of a man destroying himself in real time. Except for Sarah Whitmore. She stood apart from the others, her arms crossed against the wind, her dark hair whipping across her face. She was the town librarian, and had been since she'd come back from university 8 years ago, with a degree in history and a broken engagement she never talked about. Thomas had been in love with her since the 3rd grade, when she'd helped him find a book about tractors and smiled at him like he'd asked for something wonderful instead of something obvious.
"They're wrong about you," she said quietly, stepping closer. She had to raise her voice over the wind, but she wasn't shouting. Sarah never shouted. "I don't think you're a fool." "No?" Thomas tried to smile, but it came out crooked. "What do you think I am?" She looked past him, at the marsh, at the gray water and the skeletal trees and the vast emptiness of the place. "I think you're looking for something," she said. "I'm just not sure what." Thomas wanted to tell her. God, he wanted to tell her everything. About the stories, about the hope that had grown in him like a weed when he'd read about the auction, about the single line in his grandfather's journal that he'd found after the funeral, tucked between pages about seed prices and rainfall measurements. The old men were right about the wretch. Should have listened when I was young enough to do something about it. But he didn't tell her, because saying it out loud would make it real, and making it real would mean admitting just how far he'd fallen into his father's footsteps, chasing ghosts, betting everything on a dream. "Just trying to make something of the land," he said instead. "Same as always." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Thomas had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, down to all the desperate hope and terror that he kept locked away. "The library has more records," she said finally. "About the Wretch. About the ships that wrecked along this coast. I've been cataloging them. If you ever want to look." "Why would you do that?" She shrugged, but there was something careful in the gesture, something that looked almost like hope. "Because I don't think you're a fool," she said again, "and because this town has been calling people fools for 300 years. Sometimes they're right, but sometimes—" She trailed off, looking back at the marsh. "Sometimes fools are just people who see something nobody else can see yet." She left then, walking back toward her small sedan with her hands shoved deep in her pockets. Thomas watched her go, something warm and painful expanding in his chest. Then he turned back to the Wretch. The sun was setting now, painting the gray water with streaks of orange and gold that made it look almost beautiful. Almost. In the dying light, Thomas could see the full scope of what he'd bought. The impossible vastness of it, the sheer weight of water and mud and stubborn, malevolent earth that lay between him and whatever might be buried beneath. He had 6 months, maybe 8, before the bank came calling. 6 months to find something worth finding, or lose everything trying. Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed the number he'd been carrying in his pocket for 3 weeks. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Dutch excavation." "Mr. Van der Berg, this is Thomas Harrow. We spoke last month about a drainage project." "The Marsh project. I remember. Told you I'd need to think about it." "Have you thought about it?" Another pause, longer this time. "Son, I've been in this business 30 years. Drained everything from flooded quarries to contaminated wetlands. That marsh of yours, that's not a drainage project. That's a war. Ground's been saturated for centuries. Water tables higher than the land itself in places. You'd need pumps running 24 hours a day for months, maybe years. Cost you more than the land's worth 10 times over." "I know, but can it be done?" The old Dutchman sighed, and Thomas could almost see him shaking his head. "It can be done. Nothing can't be done if you throw enough money and stupidity at it. Question is, why would you want to do it?" Thomas looked out at the marsh, at the water that caught the last of the sunlight and threw it back like shattered glass. "Because I think there's something down there. Something worth finding." "You think or you know?" "I think." Vanderberg laughed, a sound like gravel in a metal bucket. Well, at least you're honest about being stupid. When do you want to start? Tomorrow. First light. Tomorrow, he says. The old man laughed again. You're not just stupid, you're crazy stupid. I like that. Makes me feel young again. Okay, Thomas Harrow. Tomorrow, at first light. Bring coffee. The good kind, not that gas station swill. If I'm going to help you go bankrupt, at least let me do it caffeinated. Thomas felt something lift in his chest. Not quite hope, not quite relief, but something close to both. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Check back in 6 months. If we find anything besides mud and broken dreams, then you can thank me. If we don't, well, your grandfather was a good man. Would hate to see his legacy end up at the bottom of a marsh. But that's your choice to make.
The line went dead. Thomas stood there for a moment longer, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the silence. Then he pocketed the device and started walking back toward his truck. The sun was nearly gone now, the marsh fading into shadow and mystery. Behind him, he could have sworn he heard it, a sound like sobbing rising from the earth itself. The weeping ground. The stories were probably nonsense, the product of superstitious minds and too many dark nights. Probably. But as Thomas climbed into his truck and turned the key, he allowed himself a small, private smile. Because in 6 months, he'd know for sure. He'd either prove the town right and join the long line of Harrow men who dreamed too big and fallen too hard, or he'd prove them wrong, in the most spectacular way possible. Either way, at least he wouldn't die wondering. The engine coughed to life, and Thomas Harrow drove home through the gathering darkness, leaving the wretch behind him, like a promise or a threat, depending on how you chose to look at it.
The weeping ground, Sarah read, pointing to the notation, where Eleanor's fortune came to grief in the storm of 1722. Crew of 17, cargo unknown. Captain James Whitmore and 8 men survived the wreck and made it to shore. They were captured 3 days later by His Majesty's Navy and executed for piracy. Before we continue with what Sarah discovered, if you're invested in finding out whether Thomas finds the treasure, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who loves tales of historical mystery. Your engagement means everything to creators like us. You don't have to. I found a journal, she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. In my grandmother's things after she died, written by James Whitmore's daughter, Elizabeth. She was 9 years old when her father was hanged. She wrote about it for years afterward, trying to understand why, trying to make sense of how her father, whom she remembered as kind and funny and good, could have been a pirate. Sarah pulled out another document, this one more recent, a photocopy of pages written in a child's careful hand. Elizabeth wrote that her father visited her the night before he died. The guards let him, as a final mercy. He told her he was sorry, that he'd done terrible things, but also tried to do one good thing at the end. He told her he'd buried his last cargo in the marsh, hidden it deep where the tide couldn't take it and the Navy couldn't find it. Said if she ever needed it, if the family ever needed it, it would be there waiting. Did she ever look? Thomas asked, his voice rough. She was 9 years old and orphaned in the 1720s, Sarah said softly. She was too busy surviving. By the time she was old enough to look, the marsh had swallowed everything. The channels had filled in, the water had risen. It became impossible to know where anything had been buried. Until now. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The pumps rumbled on, tireless and patient. Finally, Thomas said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been watching you. Watching you fight for this. Watching the whole town call you a fool. Watching you lose everything your grandfather built, and you just keep going. And I realized something. I realized I've been living in that library for 8 years, reading about other people's lives, other people's courage, other people's mistakes. and I've been too afraid to make any mistakes of my own." She turned to face him fully, and in the dying light, her eyes were very dark and very serious. "So, I'm making one now. I'm choosing to believe you're right. I'm choosing to believe my ancestor wasn't just a pirate, but a man who tried to do something good at the end. And I'm choosing to help you find it." Thomas felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "Sarah, don't," she said quickly, "don't say anything that's going to make me second-guess this. Just tell me what you need. Help me map it. If we can overlay these old maps with the current geography, maybe we can narrow down where to look." Sarah smiled. "I can do that." They worked together as darkness fell, spreading out the old documents on the hood of Sarah's car and comparing them to modern satellite images on Thomas's phone. Van der Berg joined them after a while, bringing coffee from a thermos and adding his own expertise to the discussion. The old Dutchman had an engineer's mind, seeing patterns and possibilities that Thomas would have missed. "There," Van der Berg said, pointing to a section of the marsh that was still mostly submerged. "If I was going to bury something I didn't want to find, that's where I'd put it. Deep channel, probably carved by an old river before the marsh formed. Water would have been lower then, especially at low tide. You could get a boat in there, unload cargo, bury it in the silt. By the next high tide, the water would be back and nobody would know anything had changed." Thomas studied the spot, trying to imagine it, trying to see what a desperate pirate captain would have seen 300 years ago, standing on the deck of a wrecked ship with a cargo that was worth dying for or killing for. "How long does it take to drain that section?" he asked. Van der Berg sucked air through his teeth. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Ground saturated deep there. We'll need to bring in more pumps, run them in series. Cost you another 30,000 easy." Thomas didn't have 30,000, didn't have 3,000. The last check he had written to Van der Berg had nearly bounced, and it was only the old Dutchman's patience that had kept the operation running this long. But he nodded anyway, because what else could he do? Stop now? Admit defeat when they were this close? "Do it," he said, "whatever it takes." Van der Berg studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You are your grandfather's grandson. He was a stubborn bastard too. Good man, but stubborn." He clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "I'll have the equipment here by Monday. We'll run night and day, push it as hard as we can. But Tom," he paused, his weathered face serious, "if we don't find something soon, I can't keep working on credit. I've got my own people to pay, my own bills to cover. You understand?" "I understand." Monday.
The water level in the target section began to drop. Slowly at first, just inches per hour, the change barely visible. But by evening, Thomas could see the difference, could see the dark mud emerging from the water like the back of some vast, sleeping creature, could see the shape of the channel Van der Berg had identified, its edges becoming clearer as the water receded. The town noticed too. By Tuesday, there were spectators lining the coast road, watching through binoculars and telephoto lenses. The betting pool had apparently closed. Jake Brennan looked embarrassed when Thomas saw him, but people kept coming anyway, drawn by something Thomas understood too well, the possibility of witnessing failure, or, more terrifying and exhilarating, the possibility of witnessing something else entirely. Wednesday brought rain, a cold November downpour that turned the exposed mud into a slick, treacherous nightmare. The pump struggled, working overtime to compensate for the fresh water pouring in from the sky. Van der Berg looked worried for the first time since they'd started, checking and rechecking his equipment, making calculations on a rain-soaked notepad. "If this keeps up, we're going backwards," he told Thomas, shouting over the combined noise of rain and engines, "gaining water faster than we can pump it out." "How long can the pumps run like this?" "Long as they have diesel." "But Tom," he paused, wiping rain from his face, "we're at the limit. Any more strain and we risk burning out the engines, and I can't replace them, not on credit." Thomas nodded, feeling rain soak through his jacket, through his shirt, through his skin to his bones. "Keep them running," he said. "We're close." "Close to what?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I can feel it. Can't you feel it?" Van der Berg looked at him for a long moment, then out at the marsh, at the slowly emerging mud and the rain-hammered water. "Yeah," he said finally, "I feel something. Probably just feel stupid for letting you talk me into this, but I feel it." The rain continued through Thursday, and Thomas's phone started buzzing with calls he couldn't answer. The bank, equipment suppliers, the electric company, each one a small crisis, a minor catastrophe that he'd have to deal with eventually, but couldn't face right now. He silenced the phone and kept working, standing in the mud and rain, watching the water level drop centimeter by agonizing centimeter. Friday morning, the rain stopped. The clouds broke just after dawn, spilling weak November sunlight across the marsh, and Thomas saw it. Saw the channel fully exposed for the first time, its bottom still muddy but visible, and there, right where Van der Berg had predicted, a depression in the earth, a hollow that was too deep, too regular to be natural. "Van der Berg," Thomas called. "Van der Berg, get over here!" The old Dutchman came running, his boots splashing through standing water. He slid to a stop beside Thomas and looked where he was pointing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Could be anything," Van der Berg said. "Could be a sinkhole. Could be where a tree fell centuries ago and rotted away." "Could be," Thomas agreed. "We'd need to excavate carefully. Can't just dig it up with a backhoe. Ground's too unstable, too soft. We'd need to—" "How long?" Van der Berg calculated, his eyes distant. "Rest of today to set up properly. Tomorrow to dig. If we're careful. If nothing goes wrong." He looked at Thomas. "And if there's nothing down there, that's it. I'm done. Can't work on hope anymore, son. I need to see something real." Thomas understood. More than understood. He agreed. This was the moment. This was where he'd learn whether he was his grandfather's grandson or his father's son, whether the stories were true or just the desperate dreams of desperate men. Tomorrow, then. We dig tomorrow. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Thomas had barely slept, had spent most of the night sitting on his porch watching the marsh in the moonlight, trying to prepare himself for whatever was coming. Hope or heartbreak, vindication or ruin. By dawn, he'd given up trying to sleep entirely and had driven to the site, arriving before even Van der Berg's crew. He stood at the edge of the depression, looking down into the muddy hollow that was either a natural formation or the answer to everything. The sun rose slowly behind him, painting the marsh in shades of gold and amber that made it look almost beautiful, almost forgiving. Almost. The water level in the target section began to drop. Slowly at first, just inches per hour, the change barely visible. But by evening, Thomas could see the difference, could see the dark mud emerging from the water like the back of some vast, sleeping creature, could see the shape of the channel Van der Berg had identified, its edges becoming clearer as the water receded. The town noticed too. By Tuesday, there were spectators lining the coast road, watching through binoculars and telephoto lenses. The betting pool had apparently closed. Jake Brennan looked embarrassed when Thomas saw him, but people kept coming anyway, drawn by something Thomas understood too well, the possibility of witnessing failure, or, more terrifying and exhilarating, the possibility of witnessing something else entirely. Wednesday brought rain, a cold November downpour that turned the exposed mud into a slick, treacherous nightmare. The pump struggled, working overtime to compensate for the fresh water pouring in from the sky. Van der Berg looked worried for the first time since they'd started, checking and rechecking his equipment, making calculations on a rain-soaked notepad. "If this keeps up, we're going backwards," he told Thomas, shouting over the combined noise of rain and engines, "gaining water faster than we can pump it out." "How long can the pumps run like this?" "Long as they have diesel." "But Tom—" He paused, wiping rain from his face. "We're at the limit. Any more strain and we risk burning out the engines, and I can't replace them, not on credit." Thomas nodded, feeling rain soak through his jacket, through his shirt, through his skin to his bones. "Keep them running," he said. "We're close." "Close to what?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I can feel it. Can't you feel it?" Van der Berg looked at him for a long moment, then out at the marsh, at the slowly emerging mud and the rain-hammered water. "Yeah," he said finally, "I feel something. Probably just feel stupid for letting you talk me into this, but I feel it." The rain continued through Thursday, and Thomas's phone started buzzing with calls he couldn't answer. The bank, equipment suppliers, the electric company, each one a small crisis, a minor catastrophe that he'd have to deal with eventually, but couldn't face right now. He silenced the phone and kept working, standing in the mud and rain, watching the water level drop centimeter by agonizing centimeter. Friday morning, the rain stopped. The clouds broke just after dawn, spilling weak November sunlight across the marsh, and Thomas saw it. Saw the channel fully exposed for the first time, its bottom still muddy but visible, and there, right where Van der Berg had predicted, a depression in the earth, a hollow that was too deep, too regular to be natural. "Van der Berg," Thomas called. "Van der Berg, get over here!" The old Dutchman came running, his boots splashing through standing water. He slid to a stop beside Thomas and looked where he was pointing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Could be anything," Van der Berg said. "Could be a sinkhole. Could be where a tree fell centuries ago and rotted away." "Could be," Thomas agreed. "We'd need to excavate carefully. Can't just dig it up with a backhoe. Ground's too unstable, too soft. We'd need to—" "How long?" Van der Berg calculated, his eyes distant. "Rest of today to set up properly. Tomorrow to dig. If we're careful. If nothing goes wrong." He looked at Thomas. "And if there's nothing down there, that's it. I'm done. Can't work on hope anymore, son. I need to see something real." Thomas understood. More than understood. He agreed. This was the moment. This was where he'd learn whether he was his grandfather's grandson or his father's son, whether the stories were true or just the desperate dreams of desperate men. Tomorrow, then. We dig tomorrow. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Thomas had barely slept, had spent most of the night sitting on his porch watching the marsh in the moonlight, trying to prepare himself for whatever was coming. Hope or heartbreak, vindication or ruin. By dawn, he'd given up trying to sleep entirely and had driven to the site, arriving before even Van der Berg's crew. He stood at the edge of the depression, looking down into the muddy hollow that was either a natural formation or the answer to everything. The sun rose slowly behind him, painting the marsh in shades of gold and amber that made it look almost beautiful, almost forgiving. Almost. Van der Berg arrived at 6:30 with a small crew, just 3 men, hand-picked and sworn to discretion. "Last thing we need is the whole town showing up," the Dutchman explained, directing his crew to start setting up the excavation equipment. "This goes sideways, I'd prefer not to have an audience." They worked methodically, establishing a stable perimeter around the depression, laying down wooden boards to distribute weight across the soft ground. Van der Berg brought in a small excavator, but insisted they do most of the work by hand once they got close to whatever might be buried. "You don't dig for treasure with a backhoe," he said. "Not if you want to keep it in one piece." Sarah arrived at 7, still wearing her work clothes from the library, as if she'd come directly without going home. She carried a thermos of coffee and a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of ceramic mugs. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing Thomas a cup. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Couldn't," Thomas admitted, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Every time I closed my eyes, I just kept seeing my grandfather. Kept thinking about what he'd say if he could see this." "What would he say?" Thomas smiled, despite his exhaustion. "Probably tell me I'm an idiot. Then he'd grab a shovel and start digging." They stood together, drinking coffee and watching Van der Berg's crew work. By 8 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered on the coast road despite Van der Berg's hopes for privacy. Word had spread somehow, it always did in towns like Saltmere,
and people came to watch the final act of Thomas Harrow's disaster, or miracle. Nobody seemed quite sure which it would be. Marcus Fell from the hardware store was there, along with Mrs. Chen and her binoculars. The Brennan brothers had brought lawn chairs and a cooler, like they were settling in for a show. Even Mayor Hastings had made an appearance, standing slightly apart from the others with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. "Vultures," Van der Berg muttered, glancing back at the growing crowd. "Come to pick the bones when you fail." "Or to witness history when we succeed," Sarah said quietly. The excavator began removing the top layers of mud, its bucket working with surprising delicacy under Van der Berg's direction. They went slowly, carefully, removing the earth in thin layers and examining each one before proceeding deeper. By 9 o'clock, they were 3 feet down and had found nothing but more mud and a few rocks that might have been the ship's ballast or might have been there for 10,000 years. Thomas's phone buzzed. The bank again. He silenced it without looking. At 10:30, one of Van der Berg's crew members, a young man named Miguel with careful hands and patient eyes, stopped suddenly, his shovel making a sound that was distinctly different from the wet schlock of mud on metal. "Got something," he called out. "Wood, I think. Feels solid." Everyone froze. Even the crowd on the coast road seemed to sense the change, their chatter dying away to silence. Thomas's heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears, could feel it in his throat. Van der Berg moved in, kneeling at the edge of the excavation with a hand brush and a careful touch. He worked for several minutes, clearing mud away from whatever Miguel had found, exposing it inch by inch. Finally, he sat back, his face unreadable. "It's timber," he said. "Ship's timber, if I'm any judge. Oak, probably. 300 years old, maybe more." He looked up at Thomas. "And it's shaped. Cut and fitted. This isn't driftwood, Tom. This is structure." The word seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Structure, which meant construction, which meant intent, which meant someone had built something here, buried it here, hidden it here for reasons that 3 centuries hadn't erased. "Keep going," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Carefully, but keep going." They worked through the lunch hour, nobody wanting to stop, nobody willing to leave even for a break. The timber was extensive, they discovered, not just a few planks, but a whole section of ship's hull, maybe 15 feet long and 8 feet wide. It was buried at an angle, as if it had been dragged here and tipped into a hole that had been filled in and hidden. "It's a cargo hold," Van der Berg said, running his hands along the exposed timber. "See here? These are deck beams, and this is part of the whole structure. Someone cut out a section of a ship and buried it. Whole thing, cargo and all." "Can we open it?" Thomas asked. "Open it?" Van der Berg looked at him like he'd suggested they juggle dynamite. "Tom, this wood has been underwater for 300 years. It's probably holding together by sheer stubbornness at this point. We try to force it open, the whole thing could collapse." "But there might be something inside." "There might be, or there might be 300 years' worth of mud and rot and disappointment." The old Dutchman paused, studying the timber. "But yes, we can try. Very, very carefully."
The crowd on the coast road had grown throughout the morning, and by early afternoon it looked like half of Saltmere had shown up. Thomas could see people he'd known his whole life, faces from the general store and the church and the school he'd attended as a child. Some looked skeptical, others curious, a few almost hopeful, as if they wanted him to succeed despite themselves. And then there were the others, the ones who'd come to see him fail. Thomas could see Marcus Fell talking to the Brennan brothers, their expressions suggesting they were already composing the story they'd tell later about how Thomas Harrow had dug up an old piece of shipwreck and called it treasure, how he'd destroyed his family's legacy for nothing. "Ignore them," Sarah said softly, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "They don't matter." "They're my neighbors," Thomas said. "They've been my neighbors my whole life. Of course they matter." "Then prove them wrong." She looked at him, her dark eyes fierce. Show them what stubborn faith can accomplish. Van der Berg's crew spent the next hour carefully exposing more of the buried structure, working with brushes and hand tools to clear away centuries of accumulated mud. The wood underneath was dark, almost black, but remarkably intact. The salt in the mud had preserved it, turned it into something harder than it had been in life. By 3 o'clock, they'd cleared enough to see the edges of what looked like a door, a hatch really, cut into the deck of the buried cargo hold. It was sealed with iron bands that had rusted into a solid mass, fused together by time and chemistry into something that might as well have been welded shut. "We'll need to cut through the iron," Van der Berg said, examining the hatch. "Carefully. Can't use a torch. Too much risk of fire if there's anything combustible inside. We'll use hand tools, chisels and files. Take us a few hours." "Then we start now," Thomas said. They worked as the sun tracked across the sky, cutting and filing and prying at the iron bands with the patience of archaeologists excavating a pharaoh's tomb. The crowd watched in silence now, even the skeptics caught up in the drama of it. This was history unfolding in real time, regardless of what they found inside. This was a story that would be told in Saltmere for generations. At 5:30, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, the last iron band gave way with a groan that sounded almost alive. Van der Berg and his crew carefully lifted it away, revealing the hatch underneath. Plain oak, sealed at the edges with what looked like tar. "This is it," Van der Berg said quietly. "Whatever's in there has been sealed for 3 centuries. Once we open this, there's no going back." He looked at Thomas. "You sure you want to do this in front of all these people? If it's empty?" "Open it," Thomas said. Van der Berg nodded and positioned a pry bar at the edge of the hatch. He applied pressure slowly, carefully, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a sigh, the seal broke. Air rushed out of the opening, carrying a smell that was indescribable, old and organic and somehow wrong, like breathing in the exhalation of centuries. The Dutchman worked the pry bar around the edges, loosening the hatch centimeter by centimeter. Miguel helped him, and together they lifted the heavy oak panel, straining against its weight and the suction of the seal. Finally, with a groan of protest, the hatch came free. Everyone leaned forward. Even the crowd on the coast road surged closer, binoculars raised, phone cameras recording. Thomas held his breath, torn between hope and terror, unable to look away and unable to bear looking. Inside the cargo hold was darkness, deep and complete, a shadow that seemed to swallow the evening light. Van der Berg pulled out a flashlight and shone it into the opening, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Then, Sarah gasped, "Oh my God!" The flashlight beam reflected off metal. Not rusted iron, but warm yellow gold. Stacks of it, bars and coins and pieces of eight spilling from rotted chests, jewelry, silverware, religious artifacts encrusted with gems. "Sweet, merciful Christ," Van der Berg breathed. "Tom, do you see?" But Thomas wasn't looking at the treasure. He was looking at Sarah, at the way her face had gone pale, at the tears streaming down her cheeks. "He did it! Captain James Whitmore, my ancestor. He really did it. He buried the treasure. He tried to do one good thing at the end." The crowd on the coast road erupted. I could hear their voices carrying across the marsh, shock and excitement and disbelief all mixed together in a roar that seemed to shake the very air. People were running now, trying to get closer to see for themselves if the impossible thing they just witnessed was real.
"We need to secure this," Van der Berg said urgently, his professional instincts kicking in. "Now, before this turns into a circus. Miguel, get the tarps. Kovacs, start marking a perimeter. Nobody gets close without my say-so." But it was already too late. The first of the crowd had reached the excavation site, and more were coming, pouring across the marsh with the single-minded determination of people who'd just seen their mundane reality shattered. Marcus Fell was there, his skepticism replaced by something that looked like hunger. The Brennan brothers were pushing through the crowd, trying to see.
Even Mrs. Chan had abandoned her binoculars and was making her slow way down from the coast road, her face flushed with excitement. "Thomas," someone shouted. "Thomas, is it real? Is that really gold? How much is there? Can we see it? This belongs to Saltmere. This is our history." The voices piled on top of each other, a cacophony of demands and questions and barely concealed greed. Thomas stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, by the weight of what they'd just found. This was what he'd dreamed of, what he'd bet everything on. But somehow the reality of it felt wrong, felt dangerous in ways he hadn't anticipated. Mayor Hastings pushed his way through the crowd, his carefully neutral expression replaced by something sharp and political. "Thomas," he said, his voice carrying authority. "Thomas Harrow, I'm going to need you to step away from the excavation site. This is now a matter of historical significance, possibly a crime scene." "Crime scene?" Thomas found his voice. "What crime?" "Pirate treasure, Tom. Stolen goods, which means this belongs to the crown, or to the descendants of whoever it was stolen from, or—" Hastings waved his hand vaguely. "The point is, it's not yours just because you dug it up. There are laws about this sort of thing." "He owns the land," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her tears had stopped, replaced by something fiercer. "Thomas bought this land legally. Whatever's buried on it is his." "That's not how treasure law works, Miss Whitmore, particularly not with historical artifacts. This will need to be authenticated, cataloged, evaluated. The Historical Society will need to be notified, the State Archaeological Board, possibly federal authorities." "Federal authorities?" Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "For what?" "To determine ownership, to ensure nothing is removed illegally, to protect what is clearly a significant historical find." Hastings smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You understand, I'm sure. We all want to do this properly." "Properly?" Thomas repeated. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "You mean you want to take it?" "I mean we need to ensure this is handled according to the law, which, I must point out, you haven't been particularly concerned with. No permits for historical excavation, no notification to the proper authorities. You just started digging up whatever you wanted on land that I own," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "Land I bought legally with money I earned. Land you all laughed at me for buying." "Nevertheless." "No." The word came out stronger than Thomas expected. "No. You don't get to do this. You don't get to stand there and tell me I did something wrong when I'm standing on my own property, excavating my own land, finding something that nobody else believed existed. You want to talk about laws? Fine. Show me the law that says I can't dig on my own land. Show me the law that says what I find there doesn't belong to me." Hastings' expression tightened. "I don't think you understand the seriousness." "I understand perfectly." Thomas felt anger rising in him, hot and clean and righteous. "I understand that when I was buying this worthless land, nobody cared about laws or permits or historical significance. I understand that when I was spending every dollar I had trying to drain it, you all placed bets on when I'd fail. But now that there's something valuable here, now that there's gold involved, suddenly everyone cares very much about doing things properly." The crowd had gone quiet, watching the confrontation with the same avid attention they'd given the excavation. I could see the calculation in their faces, the realization that treasure changed everything, turned neighbors into competitors and friends into rivals. "I want everyone off my property, now. This is private land and you're all trespassing." "Thomas, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. You have 5 minutes to get back to the coast road or I'm calling the sheriff to have you removed for trespassing." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Marcus Fell said, "You're making a mistake, Tom. You can't fight the whole town. Can't fight the government. They'll tie you up in courts for years, take everything you've got. Better to cooperate now, get ahead of it." Is that advice, Marcus, or a threat? It's reality, the hardware store owner shrugged. But it's your funeral. The crowd began to disperse, slowly, reluctantly, casting backward glances at the excavation site as if trying to memorize every detail. Mayor Hastings lingered longest, his expression suggesting this conversation was far from over. But finally, he too retreated, following the others back toward the coast road. When they were gone, Thomas sank down onto one of the wooden boards Van der Berg's crew had laid, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving him shaky and exhausted. "Well," Van der Berg said into the silence, "that could have gone better." "What do I do?" Thomas asked, looking up at the old Dutchman. "Hastings is right, isn't he? They're going to take it. Take everything." Van der Berg was quiet for a moment, looking down into the open cargo hold, at the fortune in gold and silver and gems that glinted in the dying light. "Maybe," he said finally. "Probably, even. But Tom, you found it. Whatever happens next, you found it. You bet everything and won. That means something." "Means I'll lose it all anyway, just more spectacularly than if I'd never tried." "Maybe." The Dutchman crouched down beside him. "Or maybe you fight. Get a lawyer. Make them prove their claims. Make them work for it. You own this land legally. You excavated legally. I made sure of that. Got all the permits we needed for drainage and land improvement. Nothing you've done is illegal. They want this treasure, they're going to have to go through the courts, and courts take time. I don't have time. I'm broke. The bank's calling in my loans. I don't even know how I'm going to pay you for this week's work." "Don't worry about me. I work for treasure now, apparently." Van der Berg smiled slightly. "Besides, I'm old and cranky, and I've never much liked politicians who show up after all the hard work is done and try to claim credit. Makes me want to be difficult." Sarah knelt on Thomas's other side. "This is what my ancestor buried. Buried it and died for it, and left a message for his daughter, that it would be here if she ever needed it. Maybe that's what it's for. Maybe it's been waiting 300 years for someone who needed it badly enough to fight for it." Thomas looked at her, at the determination in her face, and felt something shift inside him. She was right. This wasn't just about money or treasure or proving the town wrong. This was about a man who'd made terrible choices but tried to do one good thing at the end. About a 9-year-old girl who'd lost her father and spent her life wondering if he'd been the monster everyone said he was. About stories and faith and the stubborn belief that sometimes, against all odds, things could turn out right. "Okay," Thomas said. "Okay, we fight." "Good," Van der Berg said. "First thing we do is secure this site properly. Tarps, fencing, locks, the works. Then we document everything. Photos, measurements, inventory. We're going to do this so thoroughly, so professionally, that nobody can claim we were just treasure hunters who stumbled onto something. We're archaeologists conducting a proper excavation." "I'm a farmer," Thomas protested. "You're whatever you need to be to keep this." The Dutchman stood, offering Thomas his hand. "Now come on, we've got work to do before full dark." They worked through the evening, setting up a secure perimeter around the excavation site and carefully documenting the cargo hold's contents. Sarah took photographs with her phone, hundreds of them from every angle, while Van der Berg made detailed notes about position and condition. Miguel and the other crew members erected a heavy tarp over the entire site, anchoring it against the wind that was picking up off the sea. By the time they finished, it was after midnight. Thomas's muscles ached, his hands were raw, and his mind felt like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. But the site was secure, and the treasure was documented, and for the moment, it was still his. "Get some sleep," Van der Berg told him. "Tomorrow's going to be worse. Media is going to descend on this place like locusts. Everyone with a claim or a theory or just an opinion is going to come crawling out. You need to be ready." Thomas nodded, too tired to do more than that. He walked Sarah to her car, the two of them moving in comfortable silence under a sky full of stars. "Thank you," he said when they reached her sedan. "For believing, for staying, for all of it." Sarah smiled, and even in the darkness he could see the warmth in her expression. "Don't thank me yet," she echoed Van der Berg. "This is just the beginning."
She drove away, her taillights disappearing down the coast road, leaving Thomas alone with the marsh and the covered excavation and the impossible thing they'd found buried beneath 3 centuries of mud and water. He should go home, should try to sleep, should prepare for whatever tomorrow was going to bring. But instead, he found himself walking back to the site, pulling back a corner of the tarp, looking down into the cargo hold one more time. The gold gleamed in the moonlight, patient and eternal, waiting as it had waited for 300 years for someone desperate enough or foolish enough or faithful enough to find it. Thomas thought about Captain James Whitmore, standing here in the darkness with his crew, burying a fortune and buying his crew 3 more days of freedom before the noose. Thought about Elizabeth Whitmore, 9 years old and orphaned, holding on to her father's last words like a lifeline. Thought about his own grandfather, writing in his journal about the old men being right, about wisdom coming too late. "I found it, Grandpa," Thomas whispered into the darkness. "I found it. Now I just have to figure out how to keep it." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and deep water. Somewhere in the distance, Thomas could have sworn he heard it, that sound his grandfather had told him about, the weeping ground, crying out its secrets to the night. But maybe, Thomas thought as he secured the tarp and headed for his truck, maybe it wasn't weeping anymore. Maybe it was finally, after all these years, singing. Sunday arrived with reporters. They showed up at dawn, television vans and newspaper journalists and freelancers with cameras and voice recorders, all of them wanting the story of the farmer who'd found pirate treasure. Thomas woke to the sound of engines and voices, and by the time he'd gotten dressed and driven to the site, there were already 24 people there, held back only by Van der Berg's makeshift fence and the old Dutchman's impressive glare. "Mr. Harrow," they called out when they saw him. "Thomas, can you confirm you found treasure? How much is it worth? What are you going to do with it?" Thomas pushed through the crowd without answering, ducking under the fence line and heading for the excavation site. Van der Berg was already there with his crew, standing guard like armed sentries, though none of them were actually armed. "Been like this since 5 a.m., and it's going to get worse. Mayor called me an hour ago and said the State Archaeological Board is sending someone tomorrow. Historical Society's already claiming jurisdiction, and there's a lawyer from Boston on his way, says he represents the descendants of the original owners of the cargo." How could he possibly know who the original owners were? Van der Berg shrugged. "Doesn't matter if he knows or not. Matters that he's going to claim it anyway. Tie you up in court for years while the legal fees drain whatever value you might have gotten from this." Thomas felt the walls closing in. This was what Marcus Fell had warned him about, what he'd feared in the back of his mind even as he'd celebrated the find. The treasure was real, but it might as well be locked behind glass in a museum for all the good it would do him. By the time the lawyers and the government and the historical societies were done fighting over it, he'd be bankrupt, and the farm would be gone, and he'd have nothing to show for any of this, except a good story about how he'd almost made it. "There has to be a way," he said, more to himself than to Van der Berg. "There has to be some way to—" His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up anyway. "Mr. Harrow." A woman's voice, professional and precise. "My name is Catherine Wells. I'm an attorney specializing in treasure law and historical property rights. I've been following your situation with interest, and I believe I can help you." "Help me how?" "Help you keep what you found, or at least help you get fair compensation for it. May I come see you?
I'm in Saltmere now, actually, at the coffee shop on Main Street. I can be at your site in 10 minutes. Thomas looked at Van der Berg, who shrugged. Can't hurt to listen, the Dutchman said. Okay, Thomas said into the phone. 10 minutes. Catherine Wells arrived in exactly 9 minutes, driving a rental sedan and wearing a suit that probably cost more than Thomas's truck. She was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that suggested she didn't waste time on things that weren't important. She surveyed the site, the crowd of reporters, the covered excavation, and nodded as if everything confirmed what she'd already suspected. Good, she said. You've documented everything? Photographed it? Made detailed notes? Yes, Thomas said. And you own this land free and clear? No disputes about the property boundaries? I own it. Bought it at auction 3 months ago. All legal.
Excellent. She pulled out a tablet and started making notes. Here's the situation, Mr. Harrow. You have several claims against you that are likely to materialize over the next few days. The state will claim jurisdiction over historical artifacts. The federal government might try to invoke maritime law if they can prove the cargo was taken from an American vessel. Though, since this happened in 1722, before the United States existed, that's a stretch. Various treasure hunting companies will claim they had exploration rights to this area, which is nonsense but will tie you up in court anyway. And then there are the descendant claims. People who will come forward saying their ancestors owned whatever was on that ship and therefore they have rights to it. So I'm screwed. Not necessarily. Wells looked up from her tablet. You have several things in your favor. First, you own the land where the treasure was found, which gives you a strong legal position. Second, you conducted the excavation legally. I checked, and your drainage permits are all in order, which means you can argue this was incidental to land improvement, not treasure hunting. Third, and most importantly, you found something everyone else said didn't exist. That matters in treasure law. It shows initiative, risk-taking, investment of personal resources. Courts look favorably on that. How favorably? Favorably enough that we can probably negotiate a settlement that gives you at least 40% of the treasure's value, possibly more. The state will want some for historical preservation, the town will want some for their museums, but you'll get enough to pay off your debts, save your farm, and probably have quite a bit left over. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. 40%? At minimum. If we play this right, we might get you 60. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take money for legal fees. I work on contingency for cases like this. I get paid when you get paid. But there will be other costs. Expert witnesses, archaeological consultants, surveyors. You'll need to come up with some operating capital. I'm broke, Thomas said bluntly. Everything I had went into buying this land and draining it. I'm underwater on my loans and the bank's about to foreclose. I don't have operating capital. Wells studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. You're standing on top of $180 million in pirate treasure, Mr. Harrow. I think we can find you some operating capital. Banks love collateral, and treasure makes excellent collateral once it's properly documented and valued. The bank that's trying to foreclose on me is going to loan me more money? Different bank. I know people. This is what I do. She extended her hand. So do we have a deal? You hire me, I fight for you, and we both get rich? Thomas looked at the offered hand, then at Van der Berg, who nodded slightly. Then at the excavation site, at the tarp covering 300 years of secrets, and one impossible hope fulfilled. We have a deal, he said, and shook Catherine Wells's hand. The lawyer smiled, sharp and satisfied. Good. Then let's go talk to those reporters. Time to control the narrative before someone else does it for us. She strode off toward the crowd of journalists with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Thomas followed more slowly, Van der Berg falling into step beside him. Think she can do it? Think she can actually get us through this? She better, because otherwise, son, we just dug up the most expensive hole in history. The press conference happened on the Marsh itself, with the excavation site behind them and the gray November sky overhead. Catherine Wells had insisted on it, said the optics mattered as much as the facts.
People need to see you standing on your land, need to see the work you did, the risk you took. This isn't about lawyers or politicians or historical societies. This is about a farmer who believed in something nobody else could see. Thomas stood at a makeshift podium, really just a folding table someone had dragged from Van der Berg's trailer, and faced what looked like half the media on the eastern seaboard. Television cameras, newspaper reporters, bloggers with smartphones, even a crew from one of those cable history channels. Behind them, the people of Saltmere watched with expressions ranging from amazement to resentment to something that might have been grudging respect. "My name is Thomas Harrow," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "3 months ago, I bought 47 acres of worthless marshland that nobody wanted. People thought I was a fool. Maybe I was. But I was a fool who believed in the stories my grandfather told me, stories about this place, about what might be hidden here. And yesterday, we found it." He paused, letting that sink in. The camera's word capturing every word, every expression. This moment would be replayed on news programs across the country, Thomas knew. It would define him, for better or worse, for the rest of his life.
The treasure we found, and it is treasure, there's no other word for it, belongs to the Eleanor's Fortune, a merchant vessel that wrecked on this coast in 1722. The ship's captain, James Whitmore, and 8 of his crew survived the wreck and buried their cargo here before being captured and executed for piracy. For 300 years, that cargo has waited in the mud, waiting for someone to believe the stories enough to look. Sarah stood off to the side, tears streaming down her face again, but she was smiling. Her ancestor had been vindicated. The pirate captain who died on a gibbet had left something behind after all, had succeeded in his final act, even though he'd never lived to see it. Catherine Wells stepped up beside Thomas. "Mr. Harrow has retained my services to ensure his rights are protected throughout this process," she said, her voice carrying authority. "The treasure was found on land he owns legally, through excavation conducted with proper permits and documentation. While we acknowledge there will be competing claims and significant public interest, we are confident that the law supports Mr. Harrow's position. We welcome a thorough legal process and look forward to working with all relevant authorities to ensure this historical find is properly preserved and studied." "What's it worth?" someone shouted from the crowd of reporters. Wells smiled slightly. "We've conducted a preliminary assessment with the assistance of several expert consultants. Based on current market values for historical gold and silver coins, precious metals, and period artifacts, we estimate the treasure's value at approximately $180 million. However, this is a conservative estimate. Once properly authenticated and cataloged, the historical significance could increase that value substantially." The number hung in the air like thunder. $180 million. Thomas watched it hit the crowd, watched their faces change, watched the calculation happen in real time. That was enough money to transform not just Thomas's life, but the entire town. Enough to matter, enough to fight over. "Mr. Harrow," a reporter pushed forward, "what are you going to do with the money?" "First, I'm going to save my farm, pay my debts, make sure I don't lose everything my grandfather built. After that," he paused, looking out at the faces watching him. "After that, we'll see. This treasure has a history. It came from somewhere, belonged to someone. I think it's important we understand that history before we make any decisions about its future." Mayor Hastings had pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "And the town's interest?" he called out. "This is Saltmere's history too, Thomas. Our heritage. Surely you don't intend to keep it all for yourself." He met his eyes. "I intend to follow the law, Mayor, same as everyone else. When the courts decide what portion belongs to whom, I'll accept that decision. But I won't be bullied into giving away what I found just because it makes some people uncomfortable that I succeeded where everyone else failed." The mayor's face darkened, but before he could respond, Catherine Wells smoothly interjected, "All parties will have ample opportunity to present their claims through proper legal channels. Now, if there are no further questions, what about the ship itself? This from a woman Thomas didn't recognize, holding a recorder and looking genuinely curious rather than confrontational. The Eleanor's fortune. What happened to it? Is the rest of the wreck still out there? We believe it broke up on the coastal rocks during the storm, Sarah said, stepping forward. She'd been quiet until now, but this was her area. I've been researching the historical records. The contemporary accounts mention debris washing ashore for weeks after the wreck, but the cargo hold we found was deliberately cut from the ship and buried here. It was an intentional act, not just salvage. Why would they do that? The reporter asked. Because they were dying men trying to do one last good thing, Sarah said softly. Captain Whitmore knew he was going to be caught. The Royal Navy was closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. So he buried the treasure, hoping that someday, somehow, it might serve a better purpose than enriching the crown that was about to hang him. The emotion in her voice was palpable, and Thomas saw several of the reporters respond to it, saw them recognizing the human story beneath the headlines. This wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, about redemption, about the long arc of history finally bending towards something like justice. The press conference continued for another hour, question after question, until Catherine Wells finally called it to a close. As the reporters dispersed, already typing on their phones and laptops, already filing stories that would spread across the internet within minutes, Thomas felt the weight of it all settle onto his shoulders. "You did well," Wells said, tucking his arm briefly. "Very well. You came across as genuine, thoughtful, and reasonable. That matters. When this goes to court, and it will go to court, judges will remember this moment. They'll remember that you weren't greedy, weren't trying to hide anything. That matters more than you might think." "When do we start the legal process?" Thomas asked. "We already have. By tomorrow morning, I'll have filed claims with every relevant authority. State Archaeological Board, Federal Maritime Commission, historical societies, everyone who might have jurisdiction. We're going to be proactive, get ahead of this before someone else tries to control the narrative."
She left in her rental sedan, already on her phone, already working. Thomas watched her go, then turned to find Sarah standing beside him. "You were right about him," she said quietly. "My ancestor. He wasn't just a pirate. He was a man who made mistakes but tried to fix them at the end." "We don't know what the treasure was," Thomas pointed out. "Don't know where it came from or who it was stolen from." "No," Sarah admitted, "but we know he could have kept running, could have tried to save himself and left the treasure to sink with the ship. Instead, he stopped. He buried it. He left a message for his daughter. That tells me something about who he was." Thomas thought about that, about the choices people made at the end, when there was nothing left but the need to do something that mattered. "Your research," he said, "in the library. You found records about the trial, about what happened to Captain Whitmore. Did you find anything about what happened to his daughter, to Elizabeth?" Sarah nodded slowly. "She survived. Grew up, married a fisherman, had 6 children, lived to be 73, which was remarkable for that time. She never stopped believing her father had buried the treasure. She wrote about it in her journal until the year she died, always hoping someone would find it, always believing it was there. She never came back to look at herself. She tried once when she was in her 40s, but the marsh had changed too much by then. The channels had shifted, the water level had risen. She couldn't find where her father had buried it." Sarah smiled sadly. She wrote that she'd failed him, that she wasn't brave enough or smart enough to finish what he'd started. But she was wrong. She didn't fail. She just didn't have a diesel pump and a stubborn Dutchman and 300 years of technological advancement. They stood together looking out at the marsh that had finally given up its secret. The sun was setting, painting the water and mud in shades of gold and orange, and for the first time since Thomas had bought this land, it looked beautiful instead of forbidding. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Now we wait. Wait for the lawyers and the historians and everyone else who suddenly cares very much about this worthless marsh. Wait to see if Catherine Wells is as good as she thinks she is. Wait to find out if I saved my farm or just postponed the inevitable. You're not very good at celebrating, are you? Thomas smiled, despite himself. Never had much practice. Sarah reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his cold skin. Then maybe it's time you learned. The next 3 weeks were a blur of activity and bureaucracy. Catherine Wells proved to be exactly as competent as she'd claimed, filing motions and counterclaims with impressive speed and precision. The State Archaeological Board sent a team to document the find, and they worked alongside Van der Berg's crew to carefully remove the treasure from its resting place and transfer it to a secure facility for study and authentication. Thomas watched it go with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was a relief to have it off his property, to not be responsible for guarding $180 million with nothing but a tarp and the Dutchman's glare. On the other hand, seeing the gold loaded into armored trucks and driven away felt like watching his future disappear over the horizon, uncertain whether it would ever return. The claims came in as predicted. The state wanted 50% for historical preservation. The town of Saltmere wanted 20% for a maritime museum. A law firm in Boston filed on behalf of descendants of the original cargo owners, though they couldn't produce any evidence of who those owners actually were. A treasure hunting company claimed they'd applied for exploration rights to the area in 1987 and therefore had legal standing. Even the British government sent a polite inquiry, wondering if the Crown might have residual claims to cargo from a ship captured by the Royal Navy in 1722.
Catherine Wells swatted them down one by one, like someone clearing flies from a picnic. The treasure hunting company's claim was particularly amusing. Their 1987 application had been for offshore exploration, not marsh drainage, and had been denied anyway. The British claim was gently but firmly rejected on the grounds that the Crown had already exercised its rights in 1722 by hanging the captain and crew. The Boston law firm's claims stalled when they couldn't produce any evidence beyond "it stands to reason someone owned this cargo." But the state and the town had legitimate claims, Wells admitted. The treasure had genuine historical significance, and there were legal precedents for requiring finders to share with governmental entities for preservation and study. The question was, how much? Thomas sat back, trying to process it. He'd spent 3 months convinced he was destroying himself, watching his savings drain away, feeling the weight of failure settling onto his shoulders like his father's ghost. And now he was going to be rich. Not comfortable, not secure. Rich. It didn't feel real. "There's one more thing," Wells said, pulling out a folder. "The authentication process has revealed something interesting. The treasure isn't just gold and silver coins. There are artifacts, jewelry, religious items, personal effects. And one item in particular has generated significant interest." She opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a wooden box, small and ornate, covered in carvings that somehow survived 3 centuries of burial. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. It's a ship's log, Eleanor's Fortune's official log written by Captain James Whitmore himself. Historians are calling it one of the most significant maritime documents ever discovered. It details the ship's last voyage, the cargo they were carrying, and, she paused for effect, where that cargo came from. Thomas leaned forward. Where? A Spanish treasure fleet. Eleanor's Fortune intercepted it off the coast of Cuba in 1721 during the War of Succession. The Spanish ship was already damaged from a storm, barely able to defend itself. Whitmore took its cargo without killing the crew. He writes about letting them go, giving them supplies to make it back to Havana. He was trying to be a pirate with principles, apparently. So the treasure wasn't stolen from innocent merchants.
No, it was taken from a Spanish military vessel during wartime, which, legally, makes it a prize of war rather than piracy. The British Crown would have considered it legitimate if Whitmore had brought it to a British port and registered it properly. But he didn't. He tried to keep it for himself and his crew, which is where he crossed the line into piracy. Sarah had arrived halfway through this explanation, and she was reading over Thomas's shoulder now, her breath catching as she saw the photograph of her ancestor's logbook. He documented everything. He wanted people to know the truth. He did more than that. The last entry in the log, written the night before he was captured, is addressed to his daughter, to Elizabeth. He writes about his regrets, about the choices that led him to the gibbet, and about his hope that the treasure will someday do some good in the world. He writes, and quote, "If you are reading this, then the story has come full circle, and what was taken in violence has been returned through persistence. Use it wisely, use it well, and know that your father loved you beyond measure." End quote. Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, holding her as she shook with emotion. This was what she'd needed, he realized. Not the money, not the vindication, but this. Proof that her ancestor had thought of his daughter at the end, had loved her, had tried to leave her something good despite all his failures. The Historical Society wants the log. They're willing to pay for it separately, above and beyond the treasure settlement. $500,000, possibly more. It would go to a museum, be preserved and studied. But the decision is yours, Thomas. Technically, everything in that cargo hold belongs to you until the courts rule otherwise. Thomas looked at Sarah, at the way she was staring at the photograph of her ancestor's handwriting, 300 years old, but still clear, still vital. No, the log belongs to Sarah. Captain Whitmore meant it to his daughter. It should go to his descendants. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Thomas, that's $500,000. I know what it's worth, and I know it belongs to you. Your family's story, your ancestors' words, not mine." He looked at Catherine Wells. "Can we make that happen legally? Transfer ownership to Sarah?" "We can absolutely make that happen. Though I should point out, Mr. Harrow, that you're making a habit of giving away valuable things. First, you offered to share with the town and state. Now this. Some people might say you're a terrible negotiator. Some people might say I'm trying to do things right instead of just profitable." "Well," Wells said, closing her folder. "Lucky for you, in this case, doing things right is also profitable. The goodwill you're generating is going to help when we sit down for final negotiations. Judges and officials respond well to generosity, especially when it's genuine."
The negotiations took another 2 weeks, conducted in conference rooms and courtrooms and over countless phone calls. Catherine Wells fought for every percentage point, every dollar, every clause in the final agreement. And in the end, she delivered exactly what she'd promised. Thomas would keep 65% of the treasure's value. The state would receive 25% for historical preservation and study. The town of Saltmere would receive 10%, with the stipulation that it be used to establish a maritime museum and fund historical education. All parties agreed that the treasure would be properly authenticated, documented, and cataloged before any distribution occurred. The final estimated value, after authentication and expert evaluation, came in at $197 million, which meant Thomas's share was roughly $128 million. $128 million. The number was so absurd that Thomas couldn't even process it properly. It was more money than anyone in his family had earned in their entire collective history. More money than existed in Saltmere's entire economy. More money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. "What are you going to do with it?"
Van der Berg asked him the night after the final settlement was signed. They were sitting on Thomas's porch, drinking the good whiskey the Dutchman had brought to celebrate, watching the stars come out over the marsh. "Pay you, first thing," Thomas said. "You worked on credit for 3 months. You earned every penny." "Wasn't worried about it. Knew you were good for it." Van der Berg sipped his whiskey. "But after that, after you've paid your bills and saved your farm and bought whatever rich people buy, what then?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "I want to fix things," he said finally. "The town, Saltmere, it's dying. Has been for years. Young people leave because there's no work, no opportunity. Businesses close because there aren't enough customers. And everyone just accepts it, like it's inevitable. It is inevitable. Small coastal towns all up and down this coast, same story. Maybe. But maybe not here. Not anymore." Thomas gestured toward the marsh. "That land, it's been useless for 300 years, but now we know it has history, has value. What if we turned it into something? Not just a museum, but a whole historical park, education center, research facility, maybe even a working reproduction of an 18th century coastal village. Bring in tourists, create jobs, give people a reason to come to Saltmere and stay." Van der Berg studied him. "You know how much that would cost?" "I've got $128 million. I think I can afford it." "Not about the money, about the work, about convincing people to believe in it, to help build it. You're talking about transforming a whole town, Thomas. That's harder than draining a marsh." "I know, but I've gotten pretty good at doing impossible things lately." The Dutchman laughed and raised his glass. "To impossible things, then, and to the stubborn bastards who make 'em happen." They drank, and the night settled around them, comfortable and full of possibility. Sarah came by the next morning, early enough that the dew was still on the grass. She was carrying the logbook. The Historical Society had allowed her to take temporary custody of it while they prepared their preservation facilities, and she looked like she'd been crying again, but in a good way this time, a cleansing way. "I read it," she said, sitting beside Thomas on the porch steps. "The whole thing, every entry. My ancestor, he wasn't a perfect man. He did terrible things. But he tried, at the end, to do something good. And he succeeded. 300 years later, but he succeeded." "You're going to sell it to the museum?" "Yes. They'll preserve it properly, let people study it, learn from it. But I'm keeping the last page." She opened the logbook carefully, showing Thomas the final entry, the words addressed to Elizabeth Whitmore across the centuries. "I'm going to frame this, hang it in the library, a reminder that sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are true. Sometimes the faith we keep is justified." Thomas took her hand. "Come with me," he said, "to the marsh. I want to show you something."
They walked together through the morning mist, across land that was already starting to dry out now that the pumps were gone. The excavation site had been filled in and covered, per the terms of the settlement, but the land remained transformed. It would never be a marsh again. The water was gone, drained away to reveal the earth beneath. "What are you going to do with it?" Sarah asked. "The land, now you don't need to worry about money." "Build something worth building," Thomas said. "Something that honors what we found here. Something that gives this place a future as interesting as its past." He looked at her. "I'm going to need help with that. Someone who understands history, who can tell the story properly. Someone who believes in impossible things." Sarah smiled. "Are you offering me a job, Thomas Harrow?" "I'm offering you a partnership, a chance to build something together, a museum, a park, a place where people can come and learn and remember." He paused. "And maybe, while we're doing all that, we could have dinner sometime? Proper dinner, not just coffee on a porch." Is this you asking me out? After 3 months of working together, after finding pirate treasure, after everything, you're asking me out? I'm a farmer. We're not known for our smooth timing. Sarah laughed, bright and genuine, and kissed him. Yes, she said when they parted. Yes to all of it. The partnership, the museum, the dinner. Yes. They stood together on the land that had changed both their lives, watching the sun rise over what had once been the weeping ground and was now just earth, ready to become whatever they chose to make it. Behind them, the town of Saltmere was waking up. People were heading to work, opening shops, starting their days with the comfortable certainty of routine. But things had changed, would continue to change. The impossible had happened here, and that meant anything was possible. Thomas thought about his grandfather, about all those winter nights listening to stories about treasure and pirates and faith, about his father chasing dreams that never came true, and about Captain James Whitmore, who'd made terrible choices but had tried to do one good thing at the end. And he thought about himself, about the man he'd been 3 months ago, broke and desperate and alone, and the man he was now. The man who'd believed when nobody else would, the man who'd bet everything and won. "Thank you," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to Sarah or his grandfather or the long-dead pirate captain or just the universe itself. Thank you. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, and the future spread out before them like an open road, full of possibility and promise and the sweet satisfaction of dreams that had finally, impossibly, come true. The first thing Thomas did with the money was pay his debts. Every single one of them, from the mortgage on his grandfather's farm to the overdue electric bill that had been threatening disconnection for 3 weeks. He sat at the kitchen table where 3 generations of Harrows had sat before him, writing checks with hands that trembled slightly, watching numbers that once seemed insurmountable shrink to nothing with a few strokes of a pen. Van der Berg got his payment in full, plus a bonus that made the old Dutchman's eyes water. "Too much," he protested, trying to hand back the check. "Tom, this is twice what we agreed on." "You worked on faith. When nobody believed, when I couldn't pay you, you kept the pumps running. That's worth more than money. But since money is what I've got, take it, please." The Dutchman had folded the check carefully and put it in his wallet, then gripped Thomas's hand hard enough to hurt. "Your grandfather would be proud. Not of the money, of the man you found it." The bank that had been threatening foreclosure sent a representative to apologize, which Thomas found grimly amusing. The same loan officer who'd been sending certified letters about default was now offering investment opportunities and premium banking services. Thomas listened politely, thanked them for their concern, and moved all his accounts to a small credit union in the next town over. The kind of place that had been willing to work with farmers when times were tough, that understood community meant more than quarterly profits. Sarah sold Captain Whitmore's logbook to the Historical Society for $650,000, more even than Catherine Wells had predicted. The society was so eager to acquire it that they'd entered into a bidding war with 3 other institutions, driving the price up until it became almost absurd. Sarah took the money and did something Thomas hadn't expected. She used half of it to establish a scholarship fund for Saltmere students studying history or maritime archaeology. "My ancestor left me more than money," she explained when Thomas asked about it. "He left me a story, a connection to the past, a reason to believe in something bigger than myself. The least I can do is give other people the chance to find their own stories."
The other half she invested in the project that was consuming Thomas's days and nights, the transformation of the Marsh into something that would honor its history while building toward its future. They called it the Whitmore Heritage Site, and it was ambitious in ways that made even Thomas nervous sometimes. Not just a museum, though there would be that, a state-of-the-art facility to house the treasure and tell the story of Eleanor's fortune. but also a research center, a working historical village, interpretive trails through the marsh that would teach visitors about coastal ecology and maritime history, an education center where school groups could come and learn about navigation, shipbuilding, the complex moral questions of piracy and colonialism and justice. "You're not just building a tourist attraction," Catherine Wells observed during one of their planning meetings. "You're building a legacy, something that will outlive all of us." "That's the idea," Thomas said. "The treasure bought us time and resources, but time and resources mean nothing if you don't use them for something that matters." The town of Saltmere received its 10% of the treasure, roughly $19 million, and Mayor Hastings initially proposed using it for immediate infrastructure improvements, road repairs, a new town hall, updated water systems, all practical, all necessary, all completely missing the point. Thomas attended the town meeting where the decision was being debated, and he stood up when Hastings called for a vote. "Mayor," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the crowded room, "I'd like to propose an alternative." Hastings looked annoyed but gestured for him to continue. The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at the man who'd been Marsh Tom just 6 months ago and was now the wealthiest person in the county. "Infrastructure matters," Thomas said, "but what we need more than new roads is new reasons for people to stay, new opportunities, new hope." He walked to the front of the room, standing where everyone could see him. "I'm investing $100 million into the Whitmore Heritage Site. It's going to create jobs, construction jobs now, permanent positions later, tour guides, researchers, teachers, maintenance staff. It's going to bring tourists, which means more business for every shop and restaurant and hotel in town." He paused, making eye contact with faces he'd known his whole life. "But it can't just be my project. It needs to be our project, Saltmere's project. So I'm proposing we use the town share of the treasure to match what I'm doing. Invest it in ourselves, in our future. Build something that will still matter in 300 years the way Captain Whitmore's treasure mattered to us." Marcus Fell stood up from the back row. "And if it fails, if nobody comes, if we build this thing and it turns out to be a white elephant, then what?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Then at least we tried. At least we bet on ourselves instead of just managing decline. My grandfather used to say that the only real failure is not trying when you have the chance. We have the chance, right now, this moment. We can choose to be brave or we can choose to be safe, but we can't be both." The room erupted in debate, voices rising and falling, arguments and counter-arguments flowing like tide. But when Hastings finally called for a vote 3 hours later, the measure passed. 53 votes in favor, 22 against. Saltmere would invest in its future. Construction on the Whitmore Heritage Site began in early spring. Thomas hired Van der Berg to oversee the project, and the old Dutchman threw himself into it with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his calling. They broke ground on the museum first, a beautiful building designed to echo the lines of an 18th-century ship while incorporating modern climate control and security systems. The treasure itself remained in state custody during authentication and cataloging, but the state had agreed to loan it back to Saltmere once the museum was complete. It would be the centerpiece of the exhibit, displayed in a climate-controlled vault with viewing windows that would allow visitors to see the gold and silver and artifacts while protecting them from damage. Sarah threw herself into developing the educational programming, working with historians and educators to create curriculum materials that would bring the story to life. She interviewed descendants of Eleanor's Fortune's crew. It turned out there were 17 families in the region who could trace their lineage back to the men who'd survived the wreck, and she collected their stories for the Oral History Archive. One of those descendants was an elderly woman named Margaret Hastings, the mayor's aunt, who'd kept a letter written by her ancestor on his deathbed. The letter told of watching Captain Whitmore bury the treasure, of being sworn to secrecy, of living with the guilt of that secret for 60 years. He wrote that he should have spoken up, should have told someone where it was buried. But he'd given his word to the captain, and even though the captain was dead, and even though they all were, He couldn't break that promise. He kept faith, like Thomas did. Sometimes that's all we can do. Keep faith and hope it matters. The other half, she invested in the project that was consuming Thomas's days and nights, the transformation of the marsh into something that would honor its history while building toward its future. They called it the Whitmore Heritage Site, and it was ambitious in ways that made even Thomas nervous sometimes. Not just a museum, though there would be that, a state-of-the-art facility to house the treasure and tell the story of Eleanor's fortune, but also a research center, a working historical village, interpretive trails through the marsh that would teach visitors about coastal ecology and maritime history, an education center where school groups could come and learn about navigation, shipbuilding, the complex moral questions of piracy and colonialism and justice. "You're not just building a tourist attraction," Catherine Wells observed during one of their planning meetings. "You're building a legacy, something that will outlive all of us." "That's the idea," Thomas said. "The treasure bought us time and resources, but time and resources mean nothing if you don't use them for something that matters." The town of Saltmere received its 10% of the treasure, roughly $19 million, and Mayor Hastings initially proposed using it for immediate infrastructure improvements, road repairs, a new town hall, updated water systems, all practical, all necessary, all completely missing the point. Thomas attended the town meeting where the decision was being debated, and he stood up when Hastings called for a vote. "Mayor," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the crowded room, "I'd like to propose an alternative." Hastings looked annoyed but gestured for him to continue. The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at the man who'd been Marsh Tom just 6 months ago and was now the wealthiest person in the county. "Infrastructure matters," Thomas said, "but what we need more than new roads is new reasons for people to stay, new opportunities, new hope." He walked to the front of the room, standing where everyone could see him. "I'm investing $100 million into the Whitmore Heritage Site. It's going to create jobs, construction jobs now, permanent positions later, tour guides, researchers, teachers, maintenance staff. It's going to bring tourists, which means more business for every shop and restaurant and hotel in town." He paused, making eye contact with faces he'd known his whole life. "But it can't just be my project. It needs to be our project, Saltmere's project. So I'm proposing we use the town share of the treasure to match what I'm doing. Invest it in ourselves, in our future. Build something that will still matter in 300 years the way Captain Whitmore's treasure mattered to us." Marcus Fell stood up from the back row. "And if it fails, if nobody comes, if we build this thing and it turns out to be a white elephant, then what?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Then at least we tried. At least we bet on ourselves instead of just managing decline. My grandfather used to say that the only real failure is not trying when you have the chance. We have the chance, right now, this moment. We can choose to be brave, or we can choose to be safe, but we can't be both." The room erupted in debate, voices rising and falling, arguments and counter-arguments flowing like tide. But when Hastings finally called for a vote 3 hours later, the measure passed. 53 votes in favor, 22 against. Saltmere would invest in its future. Construction on the Whitmore Heritage Site began in early spring. Thomas hired Van der Berg to oversee the project, and the old Dutchman threw himself into it with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his calling. They broke ground on the museum first, a beautiful building designed to echo the lines of an 18th-century ship while incorporating modern climate control and security systems. The treasure itself remained in state custody during authentication and cataloging, but the state had agreed to loan it back to Saltmere once the museum was complete. It would be the centerpiece of the exhibit, displayed in a climate-controlled vault with viewing windows that would allow visitors to see the gold and silver and artifacts while protecting them from damage. Sarah threw herself into developing the educational programming, working with historians and educators to create curriculum materials that would bring the story to life. She interviewed descendants of Eleanor's Fortune's crew,
It turned out there were 17 families in the region who could trace their lineage back to the men who'd survived the wreck, and she collected their stories for the Oral History Archive. One of those descendants was an elderly woman named Margaret Hastings, the mayor's aunt, who'd kept a letter written by her ancestor on his deathbed. The letter told of watching Captain Whitmore bury the treasure, of being sworn to secrecy, of living with the guilt of that secret for 60 years. He wrote that he should have spoken up, should have told someone where it was buried. But he'd given his word to the captain, and even though the captain was dead, and even though they all were, he couldn't break that promise. He kept faith, like Thomas did. Sometimes that's all we can do. Keep faith and hope it matters.
The historical village began to take shape on the northern edge of the property. They built it carefully, consulting with archaeologists and historians to ensure accuracy. A colonial-era wharf, complete with period-appropriate ships that could actually sail. Workshops where craftsmen would demonstrate traditional skills, rope-making, sail-mending, barrel construction. A tavern that would serve period-accurate food and drink. Housing that would show how coastal families lived in the 18th century. "It's like you're rebuilding the past," one journalist observed during a site tour. "No," Thomas corrected. "We're building a bridge between the past and future, showing people where we came from so they can understand where they might go." The project employed over 300 people at its peak, and the economic impact rippled through Saltmere like a stone thrown into still water. The general store expanded, adding a cafe and a bookshop. The old waterfront warehouses were converted into shops and galleries. A boutique hotel opened in what had been an abandoned fish processing plant. Young families started moving to town, drawn by jobs and opportunity, and the sense that something important was happening here. Not everyone was happy about it. Some of the old-timers complained that Saltmere was losing its character, becoming too commercial, too focused on tourists and outsiders. Marcus Fell closed his hardware store and moved to Florida, unable or unwilling to adapt to the changes. A few families who'd lived in Saltmere for generations sold their properties at inflated prices and left, taking their histories with them. "You can't save everyone," Van der Berg told Thomas one evening when they were surveying the construction. "Can't make everyone happy. Change always costs something, even when it's good change." "I know," Thomas said, "but I can't help feeling responsible. Like I set something in motion and now I can't control where it goes." "That's called progress, son. It's messy and complicated and it hurts sometimes, but the alternative is stagnation, and stagnation is just a slow kind of death." Sarah stood beside Thomas as they watched the sun set over the construction site. The museum was nearly complete, its windows reflecting the orange and gold of the dying light. The historical village was taking shape, its buildings rising from foundations that had been carefully laid and blessed by the local priest at the request of several of the workers. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Buying the marsh, draining it, finding the treasure. Do you ever wish you'd just stay at a farmer and let someone else be the hero?" Thomas thought about that, about the simple life he had before, the quiet certainty of crops and seasons and work that never changed, about the nights he'd lain awake terrified he was destroying everything his grandfather had built, about the moment he'd looked into that cargo hold and seen gold glinting in the flashlight beam. "No," he said finally, "no regrets. My grandfather used to tell me that a life without risk is just existence, that we're meant to reach for things even when we might fall, especially when we might fall." He took Sarah's hand. I reached. I fell. But somehow, I landed on something solid. $128 million worth of solid, Sarah said with a smile. "That's not what I meant." Thomas turned to face her fully. "The money's nice, don't get me wrong, but what we found is bigger than that. We found proof that faith matters, that stories matter, that sometimes the impossible things are just things nobody's tried hard enough to make possible." Sarah kissed him, soft and sweet, and they stood together as the stars came out overhead.
Behind them, the construction site grew quiet as the workers headed home, leaving behind the skeletal framework of something that would outlive them all. The Whitmore Heritage Site officially opened on October 1st, exactly a year after Thomas had stood at the edge of the marsh and decided to believe in something nobody else could see. The opening ceremony drew thousands of people, tourists and historians and journalists, but also locals, people who'd watched the transformation happen and were curious to see what all the fuss was about. Thomas gave a speech that he'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to capture what this place meant, what it represented. He stood on a stage erected near the museum entrance, looking out at theses both familiar and strange, and spoke from the heart. A year ago, I bought 47 acres of worthless marshland. Everyone thought I was a fool. I thought I was a fool. But I was a fool who believed in a story, who trusted in faith over evidence, who bet everything on the possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible things are actually possible. He paused, gathering his thoughts. We found treasure here, $197 million worth of gold and silver and artifacts, but that's not really what this place is about. It's about what that treasure represents. The long arc of history, the way stories persist across centuries, the way faith and courage and stubborn determination can change everything. He gestured to the museum behind him, to the historical village spreading across the landscape, to the marsh itself that was already beginning to recover now that it was no longer being actively drained. This place is a bridge between past and future, between story and fact, between what we were and what we might become. It's a reminder that our choices matter, that what we do echoes across time in ways we can't predict. Sarah joined him on the stage, carrying the framed last page from Captain Whitmore's logbook. It would hang in the museum's entrance, the first thing visitors would see when they came through the doors. She read the final lines out loud, her voice clear and strong.
If you are reading this, then the story has come full circle, and what was taken in violence has been returned through persistence. Use it wisely, use it well, and know that your Father loved you beyond measure. There was silence when she finished, broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant cry of seabirds. Then, someone began to applaud, and others joined in until the sound rolled across the gathering like thunder. The museum doors opened, and Thomas and Sarah led the first tour inside, into the climate-controlled galleries where the treasure was displayed in all its glory. Gold coins in neat rows, each one labeled with its origin and date. Silver pieces of 8 stacked in pyramids that caught the light and threw it back in dazzling patterns. Jewelry and artifacts arranged with care, each one telling a story about the people who'd owned them, used them, valued them enough to put them on a ship bound for the New World. And in the center of it all, in a place of honor, was the cargo hold itself. Van der Berg's crew had carefully excavated it and moved it intact, preserving it exactly as they'd found it. Visitors could walk around it, could see the timber that had been underwater for 3 centuries, could imagine the desperate men who'd cut this section from a dying ship and buried it in the mud. Thomas watched people move through the galleries, saw their faces change as they absorbed the story, as they connected with something larger than themselves. A young girl stood transfixed in front of the gold coins, her eyes wide with wonder. An elderly man read each placard with careful attention, nodding to himself as if confirming something he'd always suspected. A couple held hands as they walked through the exhibit, speaking in soft voices about dreams and chances and roads not taken. This was what it was for, Thomas realized. Not the money, not the fame, not even the personal vindication. This. The way people connected with history, with story, with the idea that their own lives might matter in ways they couldn't yet see.